to another episode of Ask Jay. Today we are diving into all things elections, presidential, local, early voting, primaries, all of it. Before we jump in, let's reintroduce the Civic Squad.
I'm Eric.
I'm Ashley.
Fantastic. So you've heard it before. Elections have consequences. In our last presidential election, almost 100 million people did not vote. That is 42% of eligible voters in this country that did not hand in a ballot. This was, in fact, the lowest turnout since 1996. In fact, the current president claimed the presidency with less votes than Mitt Romney received when he lost to President Obama. But as low as that presidential turnout was, it's far worse for local elections. In Massachusetts, we're lucky if some of our local elections even reach the double digits. In our last city council race, only 17% of the electorate came out, and the final city council seat was won over a recount triggered by one vote. Our voting system is flawed and was not designed to be inclusive, but choosing to not engage with it is a vote within itself, and a dangerous one at that. Because even if you don't show up, there are people that will. And those that do get to have their interests met and their ideals reflected, even if that isn't representative of the whole country. So, in a year with several local elections, a presidential election, and early voting, let's get into why you need to be more active than ever. Any questions?
Why is early voting important?
Early voting is important for a couple of reasons. Some of the folks that did not vote in that last presidential election did actually cite that part of why they didn't was their schedule. They were just too busy. And there are some elements of truth to that, right? Like, it's not a day off for a lot of people. You still have to go to work. You still have to, your life continues. And figuring out when you can take a break that might be anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours, depending on where you go. And again, it's close to your home and not your work, can be really difficult. And so early voting in any year that it happens, and it happens every 2 years in Massachusetts, it just provides more access to folks' schedule. And you can vote in any location that is more easily accessible to you. And so if it means that, yeah, I can go on my lunch break because it's right by my job, as opposed to like trying to figure out how to get back home and then the polls are closed, or I have to wake up at the crack of dawn to do it, it just makes it a little bit more accessible. Especially now in this time of COVID, that makes it even safer, right? Because we're in a pandemic, and early voting, since it's stretching these votes out over 7 or 8 days, allows folks to be in much less crowded situations, as opposed to an election day where it's one big line and everyone's there at the same time for hours at a time.
And why are local elections so important?
So much happens on the local level. So if we just take our city council, for example, they're responsible for a lot. They approve the city budget. They monitor and create city agencies. They can also abolish city agencies. They make land use decisions. And so especially in a city like Boston, where we're talking about the strength of our schools, and we're dealing with gentrification, and obviously thinking about where all of these monies are allocated, that happens with the city council. There's so many people at the local level that does so much. As important as presidential elections are, and we've seen the consequences of the power that's held there, in terms of the day-to-day aspects of our lives, it's really the local elections that affect how we wake up every day. It affects our everyday reality.
Why is turnout in these local elections so low?
I would say there are a couple of reasons. Some folks do have an issue with the electoral college system, and we've seen, particularly our two generations, we've seen twice now where one candidate can win a popular vote, but not an electoral college vote. And so that has instilled some frustration in a lot of people, and they just don't interact with voting at all because they feel like it's not representative of their voice. However, the electoral college only applies to federal presidential elections. It does not happen on the local level. Every other election that we experience as everyday voters are based on the popular vote. So it's important that we get out there and we do that. I think another reason is because there's not much money in them, and they're much less visible, some of these candidates, and they're kind of overwhelming. With a president, I know I'm voting for a president, but sometimes in our local ballots, there are jobs I've never heard of, people I've never heard of, and titles that don't make any sense, and it can be a little overwhelming. So I think all those things come together to kind of make people resist getting engaged, and it feels less important for folks.
So I'm an independent. Which primary can I vote in?
Great. So let's back up. So a primary, is basically where each party decides what candidate they want to put up in the fall. So an example is, let's say that your dad is going to participate in the neighborhood pie-off. And he's like having trouble deciding which recipe he wants to put up because he feels like he's got a lot of good ones on deck. And so he calls the house together and says, hey, I made apple pie, a blueberry pie, and a mincemeat pie. Tell me which one you guys like the most, and then that's the one I'll take and compete with. And that's basically how a primary works. Now, there is no such thing as, when people say that they're independents, there's not a party for that. It just means that they're unenrolled. They're not enrolled in any particular party. And so that means for a primary, they actually get to choose which one they want to be a part of. And again, it's one. So they can't say, hey, give me a Democratic primary ballot, and then say later, give me a Republican one, I'll fill that one out too. They get to choose, but they only get to choose once within that primary. As soon as they vote again, they're back to voting for whoever they want. Cool. Any more questions? Great. So, action steps. What are you guys going to do?
I'm gonna go vote early in my election and encourage my friends and family to vote in their local elections.
Great. One thing I want to add for that is if you have not returned your mail-in ballot yet, you can actually drop that off at early voting sites. You can't do that on election day, but if you just missed the mail, you can grab that and then bring that with you and take care of that way as well. In fact, I would say now that it's so close to the deadline, that's probably the safest thing to do as opposed to putting in the mail right now. That way you can be sure that it gets to where it needs to get to go.
And I'm going to research the candidates and figure out which primary I'm going to vote in.
Good, good. Let me know how you choose. But awesome. Thanks, guys, as always. Go out, go forth, conquer, get people involved. Please, please, please let folks know that it is important to vote. I know that so many people feel so frustrated, but to not vote is a vote. Make sure you go out there, make sure that your voice is heard. I'll see you guys back here next week.